Bonjour, Kinamagan and Ireland Adishnikas, and welcome to the latest episode in our study of the US Citizenship Assessment. Today's episode, questions 76 through 80. Welcome to this week's episode, where we'll be focusing on questions 76 through 80. The purpose of this series is to help our students understand the people, places, and events that make up our civic story. It is based on the questions that make up the United States citizenship test that our immigrant community has to pass in order to obtain their citizenship. So let's begin here with question 76. During the Cold War, what was the main concern of the United States? And that answer is communism, and specifically the spread of communism around the globe. It did result in some hot wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, where we at least had covert operations going. But communism became the boogeyman that most Americans feared. Let's learn a little bit more.
During the Cold War, what was the main concern of the United States? The United States' main concern during the Cold War was communism. The Cold War was not a traditional war. It was cold because the US and the Soviet Union did not fight each other directly. The Cold War began after World War II ended in 1945. The Soviet Union was a communist country. Communism is an economic system where most property belongs to the government. The United States had a capitalist economy where property usually belongs to individuals. The United States and the Soviet Union competed for world power. Leaders of both countries worried that the other would use the atomic bomb to turn the Cold War into a real war. This never happened. The Cold War ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union divided into many smaller countries. The United States' main concern during the Cold War was communism.
Now, question 77. What movement tried to end racial discrimination? And that answer is the Civil Rights Movement. Now, often broken down into multiple groups, we often use the Civil Rights Movement in reference to African Americans who were continuously mistreated by the government and by their neighbors. In the image, you can see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marching. And let's learn a little bit more here.
What movement tried to end racial discrimination? The Civil Rights Movement tried to end racial discrimination. Most African Americans in the U.S. were slaves until the end of the Civil War in 1865. Unfair treatment of African Americans continued into the 1900s. In many places, African Americans were not allowed to vote. They had to go to separate schools and use separate public spaces. In the 1950s and 1960s, people of all races worked for equal rights for all Americans. People gave speeches. They organized peaceful marches and protests. They demanded that the government change its laws and protect the rights of all Americans. The Civil Rights Movement tried to end racial discrimination.
So you see a little bit about the civil rights movement. There's a lot more that can be learned about that in other videos and via your own research. Speaking of the civil rights movement, our next question, number 78, what is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. known for? And the answer to that is he fought for civil rights and pushed for equality for all Americans. While much of his career focused on the plight of African Americans, he was also involved in union activities and where he saw that injustice existed. This photo comes from the March on Washington in 1963, and let's learn a little bit more.
What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? Martin Luther King Jr. fought for civil rights and worked for equality for all Americans. In some places, it was difficult for African Americans and other groups to vote in elections. One citizen who is famous for helping the government change is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. worked for equality for all Americans. He led thousands of men and women in nonviolent protests. Martin Luther King Jr. believed that nonviolent protest was more powerful than violence. The government passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The laws protected voting rights and ended segregation. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. Each year in January, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Martin Luther King Jr. fought for civil rights and worked for equality for all Americans.
And I strongly encourage you to take the opportunity to learn more about our civil rights leaders, both on the African American and for other groups, including our indigenous civil rights leaders and Hispanic and women's rights. There's a lot of great information and a lot of important people that we should all know about as Americans. Moving forward to 2001, what major event happened on September 11th? And that was the day that terrorists attacked the United States. Unfortunately, a day I remember very well. The attack was led by Al-Qaeda, a group that was under the control of Osama bin Laden, who is from the Middle East. It would also lead us into war. Let's read more here.
What major event happened on September 11, 2001 in the United States? On September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked the United States. Terrorists captured 4 American passenger airplanes. They used the planes as weapons. 2 planes hit the World Trade Center in New York City. 1 plane hit the Pentagon, a government building in Virginia. The last plane crashed in Pennsylvania. The attacks killed almost 3,000 people. After the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, the U.S. began the War on Terrorism.
In fact, that war on terrorism resulted in the United States soon sending armed forces into the nation of Afghanistan, which was controlled by the Taliban. And those troops actually just returned home in the last year. So let's go to the next question. This one has probably one of the most answers of any of the questions that we've covered. Name 3 American Indian tribes in the United States. Now, the video that I'm going to click on momentarily does not mention these 3, but these are 3 that should be known to all of us: the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Those 3 constitute the 3 fires. here in the Great Lakes. So let's learn a little more.
Name one American Indian tribe in the United States. There are hundreds of American Indian tribes in the United States today. The Cherokee is a large American Indian tribe. Cherokees are originally from the southeastern part of the United States. Some still live there today. In 1838 and 1839, the United States government forced many Cherokee people to move to reservations or small plots of land in Oklahoma. The Iroquois was a large Indian nation near the border with Canada. Some still live there today. Growing corn is a central part of Iroquois culture. They use corn for many things. The Pueblo are people from the southwestern part of the country. They live where there is little water. 3 American Indian tribes in the United States are Cherokee, Iroquois, and Pueblo.
You may have noticed in the video that with the Iroquois that we saw an image of them actually harvesting sap in order to make maple syrup. And when it comes to Pueblo people, that's more of an umbrella term. There are a number of individual nations that kind of fit underneath that name. However, I would expect we would all get this question right. Just a reminder that all images are found via Google search. I do not own the rights to any included images, video, or music, and all are used for an educational purpose. Miigwech for viewing this episode. To practice, please visit this week's Quizlet. You can click on the link, which is active in the Google slide, or is attached within the Google Classroom. Miigwech for viewing. I hope you tune in next week when we learn more about our US citizenship. Miigwech, Minwa, Bamapi.